Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. My name is Elly Arrow. I am an activist against sexual exploitation in Germany, and today we're tackling the issue of sexual exploitation and Islam. Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Yes, we will tackle the other world religions, even subgroups and sects, time permitting. And yes, we will be making some generalizations in this episode that do not apply to every single practicing Muslim. Still, when addressing sexual exploitation, we think it's important to not leave any stone unturned, and we think it does an injustice to victims of religious trauma if we silence ourselves and abandon the conversation to people with possibly actual ill intent. And with that, I'd like to introduce the two women I'm speaking with today. Joining me on today's show is one of my co-hosts, Michelle Abel. Michelle, can you briefly tell the audience your particular connection to today's topic that made you want to join this conversation?
Sure. Thank you so much for your introduction. So I'm Michelle Abel. I'm in Ontario, Canada, and I'm an activist for women's rights and children's rights, doing quite a bit of work in terms of the protections of minors right now and online safety aspects. Why this was important for me to join is that I was in a relationship with a Muslim man, and I was a practicing Muslim at one point. I believe that this topic is really important. It will allow us to just cover as much material as we can in terms of what women and girls face when practicing certain religions, predominantly the Muslim faith.
Thank you. And so with me and Michelle today is our guest, Yasmine Mohammed. Yasmine is an outspoken advocate for ex-Muslims, especially women and girls who face trauma in the context of Islam. And she's the founder of the organization Free Hearts, Free Minds, which helps people trying to survive and escape oppressive Muslim families, communities, and or countries. And her book, Unveiled: How the West Empowers Radical Muslims, details her own story of surviving such abuse and is available in many languages. Finally, she also hosts the Yasmine Mohammed podcast, which I highly recommend, where she speaks to survivors and other experts on religious trauma from around the world. And all of those links will be in the show notes. So Yasmine, welcome to Red Light Exposé. I recommend people read your book for the full story, but since our time is limited, can you summarize the story that led you from your childhood to being an advocate today?
Sure. Thank you so much, Elly and Michelle, for having me here today. I just want to say two things before I get started with responding to your question, Elly. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for being brave and for having this discussion. I really appreciate what you said at the top of the episode, where you talked about how important it is to have these discussions, because otherwise we're silencing victims. And Michelle, I am so grateful to have you here and to have your voice. And I just want to give you a great big hug, because you said so much in it was just a couple of sentences, but for those of us who know, we know how, that was like the tip of the iceberg, but we know how much deeper it goes. I can only imagine what you've been through, and I'm sure a lot of it is going to be very familiar to me and very familiar to many other women who have been married to Muslim men and who've lived in Muslim societies. You were a Muslim yourself. And there's, very typical ways that we are treated as Muslim girls and Muslim women. Obviously, like you said, Elly, not all, but we're having a conversation here about the unfortunate mainstream way that women are treated in Muslim majority countries and in Muslim communities all around the world. I'm born and raised in Canada. Michelle's in Canada as well. You're speaking about Germany, Sweden. We know that this is a very dominant way of how women are treated in Muslim families across the world, whether it's Muslim majority or not, unfortunately. So in order to answer your question, I'll talk about my experience. My mom was born and raised in Cairo, Egypt. My dad was born and raised in Gaza, and they met in university in Egypt, got married, and then they moved to San Francisco, California, and they lived there for a few years. Then it was a bit too much. This was like late 60s. It was peace, love, and hippie time, and it was a bit too much for my mom mostly. My dad was fine with it, but they'd had my sister at that point, and they wanted like a more family-oriented environment to raise the kids in. And so they moved to Vancouver, where my brother and myself were born. So that's Vancouver, Canada, just north of California. By the time I was born, my parents' relationship had already dissolved. They were already split up. She was still pregnant with me, and they'd already split up. So by the time I was born, the mom that I knew was somebody who now with adult eyes, I can look back and realize that she was very depressed, very unhappy, very sad, very lonely. And she went to the local mosque looking for community, looking for support, just looking for perhaps other Arabic-speaking women to connect with. She was not in any way, shape, or form religious. She did not grow up in a religious home at all, either did my dad. In fact, in those days in Egypt and in Gaza, it was really just like in the villages or the uneducated were the ones who were religious. It was very rare to find university educated or people living in the big cities wearing hijab or in any way being religious. It was considered like for the villagers, you know. When she went to the mosque, unfortunately, she met this man, an Egyptian man who was already married, already had 3 children. In fact, his wife was a convert to Islam, his first wife. And he took my mom on as his second wife, concurrent. So in Islam, a man can have up to 4 wives simultaneously. So he came into our lives and everything changed. You know, he just put my mom in hijab. Me and my sister and my brother had to start memorizing Quran. We had to pray 5 times a day. Everything became forbidden. Everything became haram. So I was about 5 or 6 years old at this point, and practically everything that you can imagine that would be fun or enjoyable for a child of that age was taken away. Suddenly birthdays were haram, riding my bike was haram, swimming was haram, playing with my non-Muslim friends was haram, like everything. Haram means forbidden, like Islamically forbidden. Everything was haram, 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 haram. Music was haram. My mom used to love to play records. Our house always had country music playing in it. Broke all of her records into shards, passed the shards on to us and said, "Here, break this. This is from the devil." So if you can just imagine this man coming into your home and like breaking your mom's stuff. So it was a real message to us that this is the new law now, right? And my mom didn't do anything to defend herself or protect herself. In fact, she became such a zealot, hook, line, and sinker. You know, she just jumped in 2 feet and became so engrossed into this ideology that this man had brought to her. And she started to go to Al-Azhar University, which is a fundamentalist university in Cairo, Egypt. And she got her master's degree in Islamic studies, became the head of the Islamic studies department at the Islamic school. Obviously, me and my sister were put in hijab. We were also, all 3 of us had to go start going to Islamic school. Everything just kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. You know, the more she learned about the religion, the more of a zealot she became, the harder our lives became, because she felt like we needed to be as Muslim as possible to sort of repent for all of her years of wearing makeup and miniskirts and drinking alcohol and belly dancing and whatever. So she just needed to like repent for all that. And her way of repenting was through making us as Muslim as possible. And like you said, Ellie, the details of my book, I can't go through, like a lot happened. At one point, I reached out to our Canadian government, asked for help, and I was told, it's your culture. This is just your lot in life. You have to endure. Eventually, I was forced into a marriage at 19, and they chose a man that my mom said, and I quote, who is strong enough to control you. They chose a terrorist, a member of Al-Qaeda, a man that had been in Afghanistan for over a decade with bin Laden before coming to Canada to be a part of the 9/11 effort. And they thought that he was the person that would finally keep me in line and who would finally encourage me to submit, which is the definition of the word Islam. And it worked. You know, he covered me head to toe in black gloves, black niqab. Even my eyes weren't showing. I was imprisoned in my house. I had to endure being beaten, had to endure being raped because there was Quran and there was a hadith to justify this. And so who was I to argue with the almighty creator of the universe? And until I had my daughter, who was just born, she was just a newborn, and he came in and he says to me, "When are we going to get her cleaned?" I was like, "What are you talking about? She just had a bath." He's like, "No, no, no. When are we going to take her to go get her fixed?" And I was like, "What are you talking about, get her fixed?" And then my mom says, "Oh, no, no, no. We don't do that now. When she's like 6 or 7, we'll take her to Egypt and we'll get it done there." And that's when I understood that they were talking about female genital mutilation. They were talking about taking my perfect, beautiful little newborn baby girl and cutting her up with razor blades. And that was the moment I realized, like, what I had a high school education, like it was late 90s, but still nobody had iPhones. There was no social media. There was no way of connecting with anybody. I had nothing and no one, but I knew I had to get myself and my daughter out of that house. As difficult as my life had been up until that point, I realized my daughter's life is going to be even worse. Again, through a series of events that include CSIS, who are the Canadian CIA, who were able to contact me only because I was in the hospital with my mom. It was an emergency situation. Normally, I would never be allowed out of the house, but it was like I called 911 and the ambulance picked up my mom and I went in the ambulance with her to the hospital. So it was like my first time in the entire marriage where I did not have him or my mom. It was just me alone. And CSIS, Canadian intelligence, found me and they told me who I was married to. Everything was pointing to, you need to get out of here. Like all the red light alarms were going off. So it was not easy, of course. It was very complicated. And if not for the flap of a butterfly's wing, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. But I was finally able to get myself out and my daughter, and we started our lives all over again. I got student loans and I was able to go to university and got her in a daycare and started to get my life in order. When I was in university, I took a course called History of Religions, and it focused on the 3 monotheistic religions. And I thought, well, hey, I've got a third of this curriculum down because my mom really drilled into us Islamic studies because she was the head of the Islamic studies department, and it would be such a shame and a dishonor if her kids weren't, top-notch students in the topic. And so I thought, well, I know a third of this curriculum, so I'll it's like an easy A. I took it just as an elective, not realizing that this course was going to completely change everything about my life. It was my first opportunity to critically analyze Islam. I could finally question. I could finally use my critical thinking skills, which they're not allowed when you are a Muslim going to Islamic schools. You have to just do what you're told and you just listen. And if you ask questions, they tell you that's the devil whispering in your ear. That's the answer for any questions you have. In this classroom, in fact, I was encouraged to question. So it was pretty great. And simultaneously, 9/11 happened. So I was bombarded both intellectually and emotionally. And by the end of that year, I realized I don't want to be a part of this religion anymore. And I certainly don't want to raise my daughter in this religion. Watching the way the community was celebrating, my family was celebrating, it felt so ghoulish and humiliating. And it was just disgusting. And I realized there's no way I can raise my daughter in this environment. Like me telling her what I believed was right and wrong was so insignificant when the entire community is all moving in one direction. It's like a school of fish is all moving in this direction. Like who was I to think that I could encourage my daughter to oh no, ignore everything you see all around you. No, we don't celebrate the deaths of innocent people. And so I realized I have to get her out of this environment. The punishment for leaving Islam is execution. So you have 3 days to repent, and if you don't, then you're killed. And so when I decided that I didn't want to be Muslim anymore and I didn't want to raise my daughter Muslim, it was a very big and very scary decision, because not only was I afraid because of my mom and my family, but also my daughter's father. He's Al-Qaeda. I don't know where his friends are. I don't know how big his network is. He was in prison in Egypt already at this point, but I don't know who he's sending after me. And so we had to change our names, change cities. We lived basically never telling anybody the truth of where I was from or anything about my background. I would always give like different information to different people to make sure that nobody could ever connect the dots. I just moved forward. I just ignored all of my past life, all of that stuff, and I just kept going forward. Obviously, that's not healthy. You have to deal with your traumas and your issues, and it all caught up with me, and I had a really bad breakdown. But before that happened, I watched this Bill Maher episode with Ben Affleck and Sam Harris. And in it, basically, Sam Harris and Bill Maher were trying to talk about liberalism and how liberal people are supportive of certain ideas like free expression, freedom of religion, quality of LGBT, quality of women, things like that. They're very supportive of all of these important values. But then once you start to say, and these things happen in Muslim majority countries, or these things happen in Muslim communities, or this is a problem with Islam, suddenly those same people that were a minute ago championing these values don't want to talk about it. In fact, they will silence you from talking about it. And that's what made me realize I have to speak up, because Sam Harris and Bill Maher were being attacked simply for being straight white men. That's their problem. They're American white men. Nobody engaged with the argument, which made perfect sense. Can you explain to me how, as a liberal thinker, you're not going to have a problem with the statistic that they brought up on that episode, which is that 90% of people in Egypt believed that those who renounce Islam should be executed? Because that's the truth in about 15 Muslim majority countries. But in Egypt, they think of themselves as progressive. They won't kill you for leaving Islam. They'll just throw you in an insane asylum. So they think of themselves as a step above. However, according to this Pew Research, the vast majority of Egyptian citizens believed that these people who renounce their religion shouldn't be thrown into insane asylums. They should be executed. So they're trying to have a conversation about that. Nobody wants to have a conversation about that. Instead, they just attack the men for being straight white Americans and daring to even have the conversation. And so I thought, well, brown-skinned Arab woman, I will have the conversation. I will speak. Then I wrote my book, and the rest is history.
It's just incredible. Like when I hear your story and the stories of the women on your podcast and all the similarities between them, you'd think the left would be the natural ally. Michelle, I saw you nodding. Probably a lot came up for you. Do you want to come in and share what your thoughts are?
First of all, yes, Yasmine, as you were speaking, my head was just constantly bouncing up and down because it's so relatable. And I want to commend you for all that you've gone through, all the steps that you've taken. And I feel emotional to even hear your story because it just resonates not just with myself, but with so many women that are facing these issues, and we are so silenced. And I like to use the term that we are bullied into silence. And I really feel that that is what is happening, not just in Canada, but around the world. Speaking up in this way and being able to express what we've lived, because we can only bring forth our experiences, and there's no word, no law, absolutely nothing that can take away from us what we've actually experienced. And so I want to commend you, and I'm just moved and I feel emotional, and I wish right now I could reach out and hug you. And I'm just so grateful for your voice, and thank you. Thank you for all that you've overcome, and thank you for being the important voice that we need. And I look forward to the rest of our conversation right now.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
I really hope that our voices are heard. I mean, like what you said, Ellie, is so true. Like you'd think our natural allies would be Western feminists who supposedly believe in the same values that we do and are against the same ills against women that we are against. So it is beyond betrayal. I don't even know if there's a word in English to describe how I feel when they're not just silencing us by covering our mouths, they're like suffocating us, like you said, they're bullying us into silence. They're not just ignoring our stories or ignoring what we've been through. They're actively trying to control us from speaking about our traumas. It's pretty shocking. It's so cruel. I really hope that there are some listeners of this podcast, their hearts and minds will be changed when they hear us speaking and they start to realize that we are human beings and we are worthy and we are deserving of the same freedoms that they enjoy. Feminism is not a Western value, right? This is a human, universal value. For whatever reason, there's this belief that it's like, oh, it's their culture. Oh, it's their tradition. Oh, it's their religion. Oh, it's their, XYZ. And so therefore we must endure. Therefore we must not only take it, but take it silently and not fight for ourselves or for our daughters or for our sisters or for each other. Like they just want us to be quiet the same way that the male mullahs in Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, et cetera, want us to be quiet. It's that exact same bullying, whether it's East or West, male or female. And I think that's why we feel such a kinship to each other, because we are so attacked from all sides that when we find each other, it's like breathing oxygen. It's so dark and scary and traumatizing. More than anything, first and foremost, it's isolating because you can't tell your story and people can't understand your story. And so because it's so isolating, when we find each other, it's so beautiful. And I'm so grateful to have found you. And that's why I started my podcast, was exactly to find women like you and for us to be able to tell our stories in a safe place where nobody's going to shut these women down and nobody's going to admonish them and say, not all, or, whatever bullshit terms that they want to come up with, or Islamophobia or whatever, but we're going to let these women share their stories. The way they go on about like caring about women of color and caring about authentic voices, all of that stops when it comes to us. Then suddenly the voices of women of color, authentic voices of women of color, are unimportant suddenly.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
Our podcast focuses on sexual exploitation in the form of prostitution and porn, but we acknowledge that there historically and today still there are a lot of forms of marriage which are also trafficking of girls and of women. So to focus in on this, I want to sort of lay the groundwork for further conversation by analyzing some core tenets of Islamic sexual morality. And so I've made this experience since waking up to this problem and the millions affected by it. When I speak out, I have often Muslim men coming up to me saying, you complain about porn and prostitution, how it's rampant in your country, Germany. Life would be so much better if you had an Islamic outlook on these things. And they paint their ideal society as free of exploitation and abuse with like firm but healthy rules for men and women. And I mean, I have the same reaction. It's like it's laughing, crying when you hear that. But to make it more explicit, Yasmine, can you summarize for us the Islamic morality system when it comes to sexuality, as in what is acceptable sexual behavior for men, what is acceptable for women, and what are possible consequences for non-adherence to these rules?
Yeah, so there's 2 billion Muslims in the world, and each individual Muslim is going to practice their religion differently. Some of them are going to cherry pick it. You've got everywhere from like Asr Nomani or Zudi Jasser, who are like reform Muslims who are trying to bring their religion into this century, that are trying to encourage Muslims to ignore all of the racist, homophobic, misogynist passages from their religion, all the way to like ISIS, Taliban, Al Qaeda, all of those, Boko Haram, so many extremists. But if you are a Muslim, then instead of looking at, because we can't look at the actions of individual Muslims across the whole world, because we're going to have all sorts of millions of different answers. But if you look at the doctrine of Islam, if you look at the actual Quran and you look at the ahadith, that's where we can extrapolate. That's where we can make judgments here. Obviously, there's so many misogynistic hadith, like telling girls that they are less intelligent than men and that there's more women in hell than there are men, and men can beat their wives, men can rape their wives, women do not have the right to consent of their own bodies because they belong to him. And sex slavery, that's in the Quran as well. It talks about these women being taken as sex slaves and being used as the man chooses. She's a slave. She doesn't have the right to consent. She belongs to him, right? That's all women are in Islam. They are just these things to be used. As young girls, you are constantly being told that you are fitna. So you are this, how do you describe fitna? You are
Chaos?
Yes, thank you. That's right. You are chaos, and you can cause chaos, and you are shameful, and your body is shameful. It's like men and women agree on hating women. Women hate themselves, and men hate women. And that's how how all of these Muslim majority societies, that's the underlying value. You can Google it right now. I spoke about Al-Azhar University, where my mom was a scholar of Islamic studies. There are female scholars from Al-Azhar University dropping YouTube videos talking to men about when you go into Israel and we finally take back the land of Palestine from the river to the sea. Can you just imagine all of the Israeli women that you're going to get to take as sex slaves? This is a woman. This is a woman encouraging men, using women as the carrot to encourage men to go out and be martyrs.
And YouTube doesn't do anything. They don't care.
It's up there. There's many of them. There's men and women, but it's particularly heinous when it's women. There are so many YouTube videos up there, Ellie. I can't even tell you the most horrific things. These are imams from like the UK, from Canada. They're not necessarily like the ones from the Muslim majority world. They get translated and they're all on YouTube as well. But these are people saying it in English in Western countries. They are thoroughly empowered. They do not need to censor themselves, because if anybody tries to say anything to them, they just have to cry Islamophobia. And they will have scores of useful idiots in a chorus of Islamophobia silencing people from criticizing these men. So what do they have to be afraid of? What do they have to be nervous of? Nothing. They can say whatever they want to say on whatever platform they want to say it, and they suffer no consequences ever. They consider this, the kinds of things that they say, not just about women, but about homosexuals, about white people, like about non-Muslims, all of these things there, it's under the umbrella of religious freedom. They get to say whatever they want to say when they're standing at the pulpit. It's shocking how women will also view non-Muslim women as what? I don't know. Fodder. Yeah.
Yasmine, I don't know how you feel about this, but I would really love for you to address Sharia law if you're comfortable with that. My understanding with Sharia law is that in the Quran, rape is considered a crime of sexual violation. I think the word is zina or zina.
Yeah, that's not rape. Rape is not considered a crime. Yeah. Zina is premarital sex or out of marriage sex.
Okay.
So rape, as I explained, like with the sex slaves, raping of, Israeli women, Christian women, Hindu women, Sikh women, any non-Muslim women is perfectly halal. The problem is not with rape. The problem is with having sex outside of marriage. But if you rape a woman, it's not against Islamic law.
And of course, there's no intramarital rape, right?
There's no such thing as marital rape because he owns you. He owns you whether you are his sex slave or he owns you whether you are his wife. And if a woman is raped, she must produce 3 male witnesses to the penetration. Otherwise, she will be lashed 100 times for daring to tarnish the name of a good man. So the situation around a woman reporting a rape is impossible. She's put in an impossible situation, not only to 3 male witnesses to her being attacked or assaulted. No, they all need to have witnessed the penetration. Otherwise, it doesn't count. And she will be the one to be punished. There are women in the prisons of Muslim majority countries today who have been imprisoned because they tried to report rapes. It has publicly happened during the Olympics in Qatar and times like that, when there would be Western women that would be in Muslim majority countries that would go innocently because they come from Germany or France or America or some other normal country where they think that they can go and report a rape because they were raped and it's a crime, and they find themselves being the ones who are being threatened with imprisonment, or they can just leave the country quickly before that happens. But if you are a national, like where do you go if you're a Qatari national girl or an Emirati national girl and you're raped? What are you going to do? Go to the police? Of course not. Where are you going to produce those witnesses from? So what it does basically is it creates a culture of carte blanche. Any man can rape whenever he wants with no consequences, because what are you going to do about it? Not only is there no ruling against rape, it's encouraged through these Sharia laws of saying that you need to produce male witnesses or you are the one to be lashed 100 times. That's basically telling men, go ahead and rape them because there's nothing they can do about it. We have controlled them through Islamic laws. We have controlled these women so that there's nothing that they can do about it.
There has been quite a concerted effort to sanitize Sharia. People have said there's ways to modernize it, to integrate it into other cultures. And it's been a lot of attitude of, well, but if people want to, for instance, settle their disagreements under a Sharia law, like, why can't they? What's wrong with that? So Yasmine, can you just clarify one more time for us? What does it mean to be a country or even just a community ruled by Sharia law? What do you think the impact is of allowing something like a Sharia court into a society?
Well, I think that would be the fall of Western society. 2 countries that are examples of Sharia countries are the Islamic regime of Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I mean, they are totalitarian theocracies where people are executed for the crimes of being gay, drinking alcohol. Women are imprisoned over not wearing hijab, or until recently in Saudi Arabia for driving a car. Of course, I don't want that to be implemented in Western societies. We have to be actively careful to push back against any kinds of politicians who might seem to be warm to the idea of Sharia. So we had in Canada, in fact, there was a political party, an Islamist political party that tried to start up and thankfully was unsuccessful. But we do have Islamist individuals within our liberal, conservative, and NDP parties. And of course, in America, it's the same thing. And I'm not sure about in Europe. I'm sure in some countries in Europe, like probably
UK has Sharia courts, and they say it's your individual choice to use them if you want to settle out of court. Because if you have a dispute with your neighbor over the fence or cutting the hedge, you are allowed to settle out of court. And so you are allowed to settle in a Sharia court. That's your individual decision. But there are severe cases of severe crimes being settled in quotation marks in such courts.
Yeah, I am aware of that, and I find that absolutely heinous, especially when it comes to family law and women's rights, because these women will get like Islamically married or Islamically divorced, and they basically have zero rights, even though they are British citizens. If they're going to a Sharia court, they will not have access to their children. They get nothing. They get treated as you would under Islam. You don't even have the right to even ask for a divorce. It's pretty crazy. In Islam, a man, when he wants to divorce a woman, he just has to use his magical mouth because he's so powerful. He just has to say the words, "You are divorced." And if he says the words, "You are divorced," 3 times, then there you go. Islamically, they are divorced. That's all that's required from him is his voice. There is no way for a woman to get a divorce from a man. That does not exist. All she can do is go to these Sharia courts and beg the judge to grant her a divorce. So if that judge has had his palms greased by the man, if that judge is also a misogynist prick, if that judge, whatever, she's at the mercy of this judge. She doesn't get a magical voice. She doesn't get any kind of autonomy or ownership over her body or over her life. No, she's at the mercy of a Sharia court. At least if it were a civil court, then she would get treated like a human being and she would have equal rights to the man. But when you put Sharia courts in there, basically is you are allowing these women to be treated as subpar, lesser than beings in your supposed free country.
Yasmine, you mentioned that scripture is a basis for all of what you've just described. Can you elaborate on that? I know it's a big question, but can you give us some highlights from scripture?
That's a really big question, and there's so much that I want to say all in one breath, but I'm going to try my hardest to get it all through. First of all, the sexualization of women in Islam is so core that when they encourage men, how will you reach the highest level of heaven, the levels with the prophets? When you do reach those highest levels of heaven, your rewards are women. And these women are described by Allah, right? They're called Hur al-Ain, and they are described by Allah very explicitly. Their breasts are like pomegranates. Their skin is so white you can see their veins. They do not secrete. They never go to the bathroom. They never get their period. Their eyes are like this and that, like just such descriptions of these sex toys, basically, these eternal virgins. So they'll start off with 72 virgins, and every time they have sex with one of these, they're not women, I don't know what they are, the way that they describe them, that they will become virgins again. And they say that young girls who die before they've lost their virginity, their reward in heaven is to become one of these sex slaves in heaven. And that's why in the Islamic regime of Iran, if a woman is imprisoned, the guards of the prison were told by the president of Iran that the guards must rape these girls so that they don't go to heaven and have the glory of becoming a sex slave to one of these wonderful male martyrs, right? These women are suffering not only on earth, but in this heaven that Islam has invented. It's all about the suffering of women there too. Now let's talk a little bit more about here down on earth. Sex slavery. You've all heard of the ISIS, the way that they've taken the Yazidi slaves in Iraq and Syria. Yazidi are an ethnic group that live in Arab lands that are not considered Muslim. And so because they're not Muslim, they can be used as sex slaves. And you'll find the same thing with Christian girls in Nigeria. And you'll find the same thing with Hindu and Sikh girls in Pakistan. When Hamas, when they raped those girls in Israel, they talked about this. They said it on their GoPro cameras. on video, they talked about how they were now going to be raping these girls because according to their religion, non-Muslim girls are okay to be raped and taken as sex slaves during times of conflict. Islam also has, specifically Shia Islam, but Sunnis as well, they have this idea of temporary marriage. And this idea of temporary marriage is basically prostitution, but it's prostitution that is led by the Islamic clerics. The clerics are the ones that are the pimps in these prostitution rings. And they take little girls, usually ones that are low socioeconomic levels, maybe they're orphans, whatever the case may be. They're the most vulnerable girls in societies. They take them and they use them in these temporary marriages where they basically get men to pay for a certain amount of money. The younger she is, the more money they pay to have a marriage that only lasts a night. And so then that way it becomes halal, or it becomes allowed. So it's prostitution. They are prostituting these young girls. It's trafficking of these young women. And then let me continue. The Prophet of Islam married a girl, Aisha, when she was 6 years old. 6 years old. This is a man who is considered, and I quote from the Quran, the best example for all humanity for all time. So if he is the one that 2 billion Muslims are looking to as their example of the best human for all humanity, for all time, and he married a 6-year-old girl, it is no surprise that child marriage is still rampant today. Not only is it rampant, but they claw back the age of marriage. So whether it's Pakistan or Iran or in Iraq recently, they're trying to claw back the age of marriage because when he consummated the marriage, Aisha was 9 years old because they said, oh, she had her period, so therefore she was a woman at 9 years old. Okay, and so that's why they believe now that this magic age of 9, which is when hijab was put on me, because that's what they believe is now the age that a little girl becomes a woman. And in Iraq right now, they're trying to make the legal age of marriage for girls 9. They want to make it legal for 9-year-old girls to get married. If you think of any cult, if you think of any group, think of Jehovah's Witnesses, think of, any little fundamentalist groups, FLDS, anything, just imagine all of them. If sex has become so taboo and anything sexualized is so taboo, what ends up happening in those societies is exploitation of children, right? In Afghanistan, you might have heard of bachabazi, which is little boys that are taken, put makeup on them, dressed as girls, and raped. It's so rampant that they give it a name. This is the important thing here. Like, it's named. You don't just say boys being raped. No. There's like a whole culture around it. And it's given a name. Just like in Egypt, taharrush. Taharrush is what you had happening in Germany to those young girls on that fateful New Year's, and continues to happen throughout the world, which is when there's one woman surrounded by a group of males, of predators, and they all start attacking her sexually, raping her right there in the middle of the street. So that can happen in Egypt, that happens in Pakistan, that happens in India, it's happened in Germany, it's happened in Sweden, it happens everywhere now. It has a name. It has a name because it's so much a part of this regressive, sexually repressed people. And these guys that are telling you, if you followed the Islamic way of life, then you wouldn't have these issues with porn. Elly, let me ask you this, because I'm sure you know the answer. What is the country in this world that consumes pornography more than any other country?
I think you told me it was Pakistan.
Correct.
Do I remember correctly?
They are so separated. Men and women are so separated, and they can't see each other. They can't talk to each other. This isn't just Pakistan. This is like in so many Muslim majority countries, that children end up getting exploited. They consume pornography, animals, fucking necrophilia, like you name it. In India, they were putting gates on the graveyards because of bodies of young girls that were being dug up. And it's just beyond. The most disgusting, heinous things happen in the darkness. And these countries are so sexually repressed. This idea of a woman covered head to toe in black and you never see her and you never know her as a human being. You never know her as anything other than a thing to be used, whether that's a thing to fuck when you're in heaven, or whether it's a thing that is going to service you here on earth by cooking for you, cleaning for you, doing for you. That's their relationship with women. It's so complicated and there's so much, but essentially, I think that's what it really comes down to, is women are not seen as human beings. They are seen as things to be used.
Going back to the Taharush Gamia, this was something that was embraced even when I was in my own relationship. And there would be women, a couple of them, that this group of men would see as, I'm sorry, but the word that they would use was fuckable. And the mentality was it was okay because there was a mixture of Sunni and Shia men in this group that would pass these women around, and they would be able to sleep, all of them sleep with this woman for time, an hour, 2 hours, and that was considered halal. So when you were speaking about this, Yasmin, this just brought this image back into my mind. I actually knew what was taking place and trying to speak to those young girls, and they were Western women, born Canadian, blonde hair, blue eyed, and there seemed to be like a fixation from some of these Muslim men in this group, this party group, that that's where their attention was, on the blonde hair, blue eyed young girls, and they could have their way with them. And it makes me think of the journalist as well, Lara Logan, who was raped in Cairo so brutally. And I'm sure that you're familiar with the Toronto Sun newspaper here, Yasmin.
Yeah.
And I want to quote the writer. Mercifully, Logan survived her ordeal, said Peter Worthington in the Toronto Sun. But let's be honest, a blonde white woman with two young children at home had no business walking through a mob of amped up Middle Eastern men. Plain and simple, she should not have been there. And then Egyptian Salafist preacher Ahmed Mahmoud Abdullah said, quote unquote, that women protesting in the Tahiri, I believe that's how you say it, square in Cairo, have no shame and want to be raped. So here we have, from a Western society, this quote from this writer in the Toronto Sun. And then we have an Egyptian preacher basically saying the same derogatory, demeaning, ugly rhetoric. And I would just like your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much for bringing those two quotes
Thank
up,
you.
Michelle. That's really, really important. And that's exactly the kind of mindsets that allowed the thousands upon thousands of girls to be raped in the UK for so many years. Was because it's very important, as we said earlier when we were talking about Western feminists, how it feels like the same words, the same controlling attitude is coming east and west. We're seeing a very similar paradigm here. When these young girls in Rotherham and all around the UK, when they were being raped, the Pakistani gangs of men that were raping these girls saw them as nothing, things to be used, right? And the police, the journalists, the politicians, the British police, the British politicians, the British journalists also saw these girls as nothing and also blamed these girls. They were being drugged up. That's how they kept them in sex slavery, right? Was through promising the next hit. And so they were 100% victims. These were children, for fuck's sake. Like, this isn't even it turns my stomach that we even are having this conversation. Yes. But they treated these girls as nothing just as much as the rapists treated these girls as nothing. It was so poignant for you to bring those two quotes because people need to see this. They need to look this in the face and they need to recognize how their rhetoric mirrors exactly the rhetoric of the most heinous, brutal, misogynist rapists. And then you have to realize we have a problem here, don't we? Like, this needs to be addressed. Our constant capitulation, our constant need to defend anything that Muslim men do, to the point of a gang of them raping an American journalist, that we're going to find a way to victim blame her. That we've got little girls that are in foster care. They don't even have families to protect them. And they get pulled into these rape gangs, and we're going to find a way to blame these girls. They have police officers calling these girls slags and whores and sluts. Children, this is how they're speaking about them.
This is all very heavy stuff. I'm thankful for the people who continue to listen to this. I'm engaging with the topic of sexual exploitation all the time, but I found some exceptionally horrific cases. So one thing I noted, all of this we've already touched on, but I'll just expand a bit. One, the only country in the world, as far as I could find out, that still executes women in prostitution explicitly for being in prostitution is Iran. But if we consider that extramarital sexual activity, consensual or abusive, is often socially or legally punished, the actual number of women imprisoned, beaten, or killed for being sexually exploited is a lot higher. Right, so we will actually never know how many women were traumatized or had their lives cut short as a consequence of blaming the victim. Then we also have the other element when it comes to sexually exploited men and boys, where we have widespread criminalization of homosexuality. And so the most terrific example I found is that actually the Taliban are executing boys who are victims of bachabazi, of the dancing boy exploitation practice. And so they would say, oh, we're against prostitution, but we know that the perpetrators, the abusers, are mostly let go, while it can be the victim beaten, imprisoned, or actually killed. In the prostitution debate, we talk so much about stigma, but I've never heard the people who always talk about stigma, as real as that issue is, discuss when that stigma becomes as lethal as it does in Islamic communities or societies. I feel like what we've talked about already answers the question a bit, but I'll still posit it, which is when a male or a female victim of exploitation in prostitution or in porn, when they are in distress and they're looking for help, what reaction, unfortunately, can they often expect from family members, society, or the state?
It will be their fault. What happens quite often with girls is they are forced to marry their rapist because they say, well, you're damaged now and we can't marry you off to any decent man. So you have to be married off to this guy because who else is going to want you now? So not only has she been victimized in that moment, but she has to be continually victimized for the rest of her life. I just want to go back to what you said about Iran. As I mentioned, the Iranian clerics are the pimps. And for them to execute women for the crime of prostitution, what they are doing is they are executing any woman who dares think that she can do what she wants with her body. It's not about prostitution, because if she were in their prostitution rings, if she was being trafficked by them, then it would be perfectly fine. But the problem is that she's doing it without their consent or without their control, actually. So that's the problem here.
Something that, again, Yasmine was saying made me think of my own Egyptian girlfriend. And I wanted to ask, because she was forced to to marry her first cousin. And when we talk about forced marriage, this is the other face of forced marriage. What is the belief system behind marrying your first cousin? And if you even dare to refuse, they can threaten to take your life.
Yeah.
Also, why is it that the health risks in procreating isn't considered?
Yeah, great questions. So, first of all, let's talk about forced marriages. In Islam, a woman doesn't even have to be there at her marriage. Like, not only is her consent not needed, but even her presence isn't needed. When I was married off to that Al Qaeda terrorist, I wasn't there. There's so many women that come on my podcast, tell their stories. They weren't even there when the marriages occurred. We are so irrelevant to the marriage that our presence is not even required. Girls and women are just irrelevant to any equation. And then when you ask about first cousins, one of the things that I skipped over, which is in more detail in my book, is how I was taken to Egypt, dropped off there. I thought I was going to be going home in the morning, but I woke up in the morning, my family were all gone. I was left there against my will. And my family proceeded to force me into a marriage with my cousin. It is so common in some countries more than others. It is so normalized. The idea that you would be against it is like considered you're a Western puppet for thinking that there's something wrong with marrying your cousin. My mom has a twin, okay? My mom has a twin sister. Her twin sister wanted me to marry her son. Like, it's beyond, are you insane? Like, you share the same DNA as my mother. Like, this is literally my brother. Like, what the hell is wrong with you people? And for me to be grossed out at that made my aunt so angry because she thought I was like grossed out at her wonderful, perfect, beautiful prince of a son, right? But for me to have a problem with marrying not just my first cousin, but like my mom's twin's son was me. That was a me problem. Like, I was the one with the problem. I was the bad person. So much so that my aunt just has nothing but horrible things to say about me to this day. Like, it's beyond normalized. It is encouraged. You know, it keeps it everything within the family. The way they saw it for me was I was a troublemaker and I was problematic. And if I were to marry outside the family, then I would bring my shame to the outside world. Some other family would know how I was a big mouth and how I pushed back and how I questioned and how I didn't listen and I didn't do what I was told. But if it was within the family, then they're keeping the shame within the family. Yes. That's one of the reasons. There's so many other reasons why, but for basically a litany of reasons, they find that it's preferable.
Yes.
Even.
Yes. Thank you for that. And it makes me think, I talked to other Muslim women who were forced to marry their cousins, their first male cousins. And then this practice of the mothers standing outside of the door to receive that first blood on the white linen. And I just, as a woman, I can't imagine what that does to you mentally. And I know what it has done to those women mentally. And I'm so grateful that I wasn't subjected to that. And thank God I wasn't, because when I met mine, I had already had a child and the circumstances were quite different. But, just even being told about those stories and the humiliation, the degradation that they went through, it's something that I have struggled with to just absolutely wrap my head around that. And as also a survivor of childhood rape and exploitation and trafficking in this country, it is just unbearable to sit and listen to some of these women pour out their hearts. And there really isn't a lot that we can say as women to really bring comfort. And so I really do struggle with that, as I'm sure, that we all do.
Yeah, I mean, you should struggle with it because it's so inhumane and it's so
Yes.
heinous and it's so horrible and it's so unbased in reality. So, this idea that when the hymen breaks, then there will be blood and therefore she is a
Yes.
virgin, that is a
Mhm.
fallacy. And girls would be beaten, tortured, and killed if they didn't bleed on their wedding
Yes.
night because they were told you're not a virgin, because they expect that there be blood the first night. That's not necessarily going to happen. She could have been a virgin, but it doesn't mean that she's necessarily going to bleed. I mean, obviously, whether she's a virgin or not, none of this should be happening, and no girls should be being beaten and tortured and raped and killed, obviously. But it's like the extra injustice of the fact that it's like burning the witches, is what it is. It's like if we burn you and you survive, then okay, you're a witch, or if you don't survive, then you're not a witch, or whatever it was. And it's like, well, she's now burned to a crisp, so oops, you were wrong, she's not a witch. Like it's based in their own
Yes.
bullshit that they've made up in their imaginations. And so these young girls, whether they're being ostracized by the community, because Michelle, what you didn't talk about, which adds an extra layer of disgustingness to this, is the way that the mother-in-law would take the sheet and go through the
Hmm.
streets with
Yes.
it, show everybody, wave it around, and say, look, 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 my daughter-in-law is a pure virgin.
Yes.
And so if the mother-in-law doesn't come out with that sheet with blood on it, then everybody in the community is now looking at this girl and thinking that she wasn't a virgin, which is the worst possible thing that you can be, because that's your only purpose in life. Your only purpose in life is to stay a virgin until you're raped by the man they marry you off to, and then you continue to have his children and be a slave to him until you die. That's your lifespan.
Yes. And part of that too, and I'm sure you've heard the stories from women that were raped prior to being married off. And that anxiety that they felt of how are they going to explain that there's no blood there? How are they going to produce this blood? And I do know of a couple stories where the women had to produce ketchup,
Okay.
and those were
Yeah.
from
So it's
young
common.
brides that I was told that many
Yeah.
years ago in the mosque, just sharing stories. And so there just seems to be no escape, no escape.
Yeah. No, there's no escape. There's absolutely no escape. You're right. Also, what commonly happens is that a girl will have like a ring with something pointy or sharp on it, and she'll prick
Okay.
herself just to make sure that she does bleed.
Mm.
All sorts of like ways to mitigate this. Like there's ways of like girls trying to protect themselves over not bleeding on that night and then everybody finding out, and so they're trying to find ways to produce that blood somehow.
Yes.
I've heard that there are doctors who will
Hmm.
do something called a hymen reconstruction, which is not really scientific, or they put in some kind of mesh. I don't know exactly how it works. I don't know if I want to know, but it's medical malpractice. If a woman comes to you and says, I need this procedure, she needs a safe house, is what I think. But there are medical doctors doing these procedures, so she definitely will bleed. I have one question I want to ask this sensitively because I don't want to blame any woman for her involvement in the sex industry. But there are some anecdotes of women who are ex Muslims who feel that creating pornography is a middle finger to the Islamists. And I can see where they're coming from, but then I think of You know how Mia Khalifa was made to do hijab porn and she just got death threats for it. And she didn't do it as a political statement. It's just a niche that pornographers want to explore. I don't want to tell any woman who has religious trauma how to deal with that trauma. But at the same time, on here, we don't think that porn is a medium that's ever helpful to women.
Or to
You can have
men.
all the good intent. We don't think it is. And if you'll feel comfortable speaking on this, I'd like to hear
people
your thoughts.
do a lot of things when they are suffering from trauma. I was speaking to one ex-Muslim woman who said that when she left the religion, she described herself as feral. I was absolutely feral, she said. And I thought, well, that's such a great word, because what we were not able to get into in this podcast is how, as a woman in Islam, you have no sense of self. You have no agency. Yeah. You don't love yourself. There's no such thing as boundaries. Like I mentioned, you are just a thing to be used. And so when they see themselves as a thing to be used, what a lot of these women are doing is they think that by going to the polar opposite, so you forced me into niqab and you told me that I can't have sex, so I'm going to go on the exact opposite and I'm going to not wear any clothes and I'm going to have sex with people on camera. They think that it is empowering. It's like a rubber band. They just want to fling in the opposite direction, you know? Those women, in my opinion, are unhealed. They haven't reached the point yet where they start to value themselves and to think of themselves as loving and important and valuable. They're still thinking of themselves as a thing to be used. But rather than some man choosing when I get to be used or how I will get to be used, I will decide for myself and I will collect the money and I will be empowered. It's an extreme response, but it's a horseshoe theory. Sometimes the two extremes are more similar than they look initially. But if a woman who was brought up to see herself as nothing is able to heal and is able to love herself and value herself and understand boundaries and heal her traumas, then that would not be a direction that she would choose. I think at that point, she would start to recognize how similar both of these extremes are.
I have seen some disagreement in the ex-Muslim or liberal Muslim community as to whether there can be such a thing as a reformed Islam. And people say, well, there's millions of people practicing Christianity or Judaism, and they believe in equality of the sexes and acceptance of self-determined sexuality. Why couldn't this happen for Islam? What do you think, Yasmine? Is it possible to reform this religion on these
anything
specific
is
issues?
possible. I won't say that it's impossible, but I will say that it's very difficult, and it's not something that I would commit my life to. So I did mention a few Muslims that I work with in an organization called the Clarity Coalition that I co-founded with Ayan Hirsi Ali. There are lots of Muslims that work with us. Muslims like Raheel Raza, who I mentioned right before we started recording, who runs an organization called Muslims Against Anti-Semitism in Toronto, Canada. An amazing woman, a Muslim woman from Pakistan, but, she is a reform Muslim. So she wants to get rid of all the anti-Semitism in Islam, which is like, that alone, if we just stopped right there, like that's going to take a few lifetimes for her. I fully support her in her work and in her goals, but it's not something that I would ever bother with trying to achieve because it is almost insurmountable. Yes. If we're talking about anti-Semitism alone, we're not going to even talk about all of the other issues. But if you just take one of the issues, just take anti-Semitism alone, it is so pervasive. It's so in the water they drink and in the air they breathe and such a part of everyday life that to think that there could be a way to stop that in my lifetime is like ridiculous. Like it's just not going to happen. There are too many powers pushing in the other direction. I think that Islam has a lot of problems. Not just political Islam. We talk about political Islam a lot. You know, we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir. We talk about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. We talk about Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis. You know, the Islamic regime of Iran, Afghanistan. I could go on and on and on, right? There's a lot of problems with the theocracies and the terrorism and things like that. But a lot of the things that Michelle and I were talking about, these things that happen to girls in an everyday, you know, child marriages, or this hymen bullshit we were talking about, or the taharrush, the girls being gang raped, and all of these things, that has nothing to do with political Islam. That's just Islam. There's just so many problems that I don't think it is worth my time or energy. I will throw away that baby with the bathwater. Like, just let it all go. But like I said, I fully support the people who want to reform their religion, because of course I want that too. Of course, I would rather have a reform Muslim as my neighbor, or as, you know, their children being classmates with my children in school or whatever. I'd much prefer those Muslims over the fundamentalists. And so, of course, I'll support that. But I don't want Islam to be a part of my life at all. And I won't spend my time and energy trying to put lipstick on this pig, you know, like, just let it go. It's not redeemable in my eyes.
You know, something that comes to mind is just that we are considered disposable objects. I'm sitting here and I'm listening to everything that you're saying, and it's just so resonating within me and my experiences and things that I haven't even thought about for years. You know, it makes me think about an incident where the same man that was demanding that I embrace Islam, I have to wear the hijab, I have to learn how to pray, I have to learn how to speak Arabic and different dialects of Arabic as well. This is the same man that drove me to a house to make pornography. And the dichotomy of that is just so mind-blowing.
It's
And
not
so,
really a dichotomy,
as
though,
you
is
know,
it, Michelle?
no, it really isn't. And I think that's the word that just was floating around in my head. But no, you're absolutely right. It's not. It's purposeful. It's what they do. It's the double standards of what they pick and choose that you must embrace, and then you're objectified or discarded whenever they see it fit to fit their needs and their desires.
Thing to be used. And so he will use you how he wants to use you, whether it's telling you to wear hijab or whether it's telling you to do pornography, whatever it is, he's taking your body and he's using it how he wants it to be used.
Absolutely. Wow. This is just so powerful. I'm so grateful that we have the time to be together, Elly and Yasmine, because I just think that we're speaking from our heart. And again, you know, this may be hard for other women to embrace, but I always feel after doing webinars or conferences, whatever we do, we are just trying to reach women. And that is so important to me. And so if it means going through the hard stuff or having emotions come up for all of us, it's just so important to get the message out there and let these women know that we understand, we relate, and we're here to support you and help you through your journey, whatever that looks like.
So, speaking of help, Yasmine, if listeners want to support your efforts and the many people you work with help ex-Muslims and feminists fight this form of purity and of
just
rape
right
culture,
before I respond to that, I just want to say
started?
thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing what you shared with us. Thank you so much for being so brave and so vulnerable. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. And I'm incredibly grateful that you were able to overcome it and be here today, and that we get to hear your wonderful, strong, powerful, empowered voice. Yeah, to support me, you can go to yasminemohammed.com, which is my website. You can also go to my organization, freeheartsfreeminds.com, which supports men, women, people from all over the world who are suffering under Islamic extremism, who grew up in Islamic societies, countries, communities, and who are now trying to overcome their religious trauma. It is a very long and difficult healing process, and quite often we have to do it alone because it's very scary, because as I mentioned, the punishment is execution. And Michelle, I'm sure when you were leaving this man and you were starting your life all over again, I'm sure it must have been absolutely devastating to go through that, isolating, terrifying. And so the organization is for people like you, for people like me, because when I was going through that, I also went through it completely alone. And so now we have a community, we have a support system, and so nobody ever has to go through it alone ever again. I feel the same way. Thank you. Thank you to you both. I'm really, really grateful to have been part of this conversation. As dark as everything was that we talked about, meeting you, Michelle, and appreciating you, and you, Elly, for your bravery, for having these difficult conversations. I'm so grateful to you both. And I actually feel quite happy, strangely. I feel so happy and appreciative of both of you, despite all of this darkness. It's opportunities like this that really provide light. And I just want to thank you both.
I'd like to send lots of love across the Atlantic to both of you. Yes.
Thank you. Absolutely.
And thank you to all the listeners. We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.